All right, so today we're going to be installing a Walbro 450 fuel pump into an R32 Skyline GTST. This video will apply to any early 90s Nissan with the style of fuel pump hanger that we have in this video. But for right now, we're just going to be installing it to a Skyline. That's our most common install procedure. The S13, 240SX, or Sylvia is probably the most similar one that you'll apply this video to. But you can apply this video to pretty much any fuel pump install as long as you're able to rework the information and apply it to your application. So for the tools you're going to need to do this install, here's a couple things. We'll probably come across more things as we move along in the video on what you'll need. But some simple things, a heat gun. I recommend the heat gun when you're doing fuel system work so you don't catch anything on fire. I have had people before tell me stories about using a lighter in their trunk with the gas or with the fuel pump out of the tank. Doesn't end well. Next up, 10 mil, 8 mil, some pliers, Phillips, flathead, and some crimpers. We will be crimping everything in this video. It is a better way to connect your electrical connections over solder for vibration and stuff like that. But there is one catch, it has to be a good crimp. If it's not a good crimp, it's not better than solder. So we'll cover a little bit more of that on this video. So the first thing you want to do when you're installing or removing your fuel pump, remove the fuel cap. Fuel tank does pressurize and it will push fuel out of the fuel line when you go to remove the fuel lines once you get in there. You hear a little bit of a fizz, maybe, maybe not. There was a little bit of pressure in there. If you loosen it, don't take it all the way out. Close it, don't close it all the way so you don't forget. And then one other thing you can do prior to this is we could pull the fuel pump fuse out, try to start the car a couple of times, let the fuel burn out of the system, remove all the pressure from inside the line. In the Skyline, the fuel pump fuse is located inside, behind this access panel here. This car doesn't have the panel on it. All right, so when you're under here, you're gonna see there's 2 rows of fuses. The top row, number 6 from the left, is gonna be your fuel pump fuse. It's a 15 amp. Go ahead and remove that. Make sure the car is in neutral. If you have a clutch switch, obviously you have to press the clutch in. If it doesn't start, you're good to go ahead and start removing the fuel lines. You're going to want to remove your trunk interior if you have it. This car does not have trunk interior, so this makes this job a lot easier. It does have a couple pieces, but no carpet, no spare tire, no wood for the bottom or anything like that. So you're going to want to start off just by taking off the fuel pump cap here. I've already begun loosening the bolts prior. Remove this plate here, set it aside. All right, so there's a little bit of a clip underneath this blue connector here. If it's old, it probably will break when you go to remove it, so don't lose any sleep over that if it does break. It is kind of a push and spread clip, so there's not really an easy way to get underneath there to remove it. Okay, once you have that connected, you could remove this panel at any point. I'm just going to remove it now. Okay, now that you have that out, you can remove this. This is just some foam vibration isolation tape, so you'll probably have to rip it unless yours is not glued on very well. I like to remove the wiring harness from the hat here just by pushing this grommet out because it is quite big and in your way. Put that over there. We're going to go ahead, we're going to remove the first fuel line. This is the high pressure line. These cars are often modified or worked on in Japan, or previous owner could have touched it. Usually the high pressure line will have the clamp with the screw on it. The low pressure line will have a squish clamp on it. This can be incorrectly installed, so don't take that as a fact. It could both have screw clamps, it could both have squish clamps, whatever someone has gone around and messed with before, it could have. All right, now that you got your clamp loose, you're just gonna wanna rotate it, try to get it off the line. I always like to go towards the fuel hat so it's not in your way when you get to the ribbed portion of the line when you go to push it off. The lines are sometimes hard and brittle and old. Okay, it's gonna take a bit of effort to try and break the rubber hose loose. Okay, once you know you've got it loose, I like to put a rag over my hand and cover what I'm doing just in case some fuel does spray out. You don't want to get anything in your eye. Okay, now that you've got your fuel line off, you can just go ahead and tuck it off to the side. All right, moving on to the next line, the low pressure line, the return fuel line. Careful not to actually damage the hose itself. Nice, very nice. Okay, now that you've got your fuel lines off, go ahead and I'd recommend removing the clamps off the hanger before you take the hanger out. I have dropped them in the tank before. Obviously you got to stick your hand in there sometimes, but avoid that at all costs. All right, so now that you've got your fuel lines off, you can go ahead and remove the 6 8mm bolts that are holding down the fuel pump hanger. might be a little stuck. The O-ring does stick sometimes. Pop your fuel pump hanger out. And wow, that is really horrible. All right, so we just pulled the fuel pump hanger out of this car. We expected some debris and rust. The client did say the car was sitting for a very long time. This is probably one of the worst ones I've ever seen. There's so much rust and buildup on the bottom of this pump that we're not probably going to be able to use this hanger anymore. As soon as I remove this, it's probably going to break off the bottom. I'm surprised that the car even ran with this in there. The fuel pump still worked. It did have a smell of old gas, which was expected. We hadn't quite got to this part of this project yet, but we're probably going to have to go ahead and clean the tank out, make sure we get all the rust out of the tank, see if the tank's even reusable first off, and then once that's done, we'll go ahead and we'll just install this good used unit. This client is just doing like a stock rebuild, so he doesn't need anything special. No aftermarket drop-in hangers needed for this project yet. We'll go ahead, we'll clean this up, and then we'll move on to the rest of the video installing everything on this one. So we're going to do a little bit of this, what you would do here, but then move on to this one just because this one is so poorly corroded. We're probably going to end up not using it. Obviously we're not going to use it, but we're probably not going to be able to even remove the pump without breaking it. I think it's a cool piece, so I'm going to keep it assembled. We're losing debris as we speak here. But so anyways, you're going to want to just remove the fuel pump, remove this rubber boot from here, if you even can. So you remove that rubber boot. Both of the screws are on the back side, so you're going to have to actually remove the pump. So you can go ahead, you can pull this clamp off, slide the fuel pump up a little bit, pull it out of the hanger, and then slide down. Once you have that off, you can undo these two Phillips screws in here. You can see here and here. And then we'll move on to here. In order to install the fuel pump, you need to upgrade the wiring inside here. The factory wiring that is running through here is not sufficient to support the current. It's also anywhere from 20 to 30 years old by now. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to install some Radium bulkhead studs. This will allow the wiring to be upgraded to the correct size you require for the fuel pump. And then you'll also be able to remove the older fuel pump wiring. So we'll go ahead and we'll show you that now. On other hats, you do have to drill extra holes. On this hat, I like to reuse the power and ground holes that are already here by just drilling out the rivets for these two studs here and then pulling them out from the top. So in order to access this one rivet here, this is the power for the pump. We're going to have to remove this fuel level sender. So it's just this one Phillips screw. You won't be able to completely remove it because it is soldered on both ends. You can just slide it off the hanger, move it to the side. You're just going to want to drill the center out here. You don't want to go too far. Once you get that center out, it'll just pop right out. So once you have that out, you can see here, the power stud just pops right out. And then you're probably going to have to clean up the surface here a little bit. We are going to be using a Teflon washer that does come with the kit to seal any fuel vapor or fuel leakage. So there is a bit of an isolator from the metal similar to what this is going to do and what this will do, this little sleeve here. So I'm just going to trim it across so it's out of our way. Okay. This plastic is all one piece and it does break quite easily, so you're going to want to kind of hold your finger on the end here. You only want to break it off up to the point that the other one ends. Okay. Once you got the plastic cut off, you can go ahead and you can just sand the backside clean. Again, this little Teflon washer is going to be doing all the sealing. So you're going to want to make sure you remove enough of the plastic to fit this Teflon washer in here for when you install the stud. Once you got that one cleaned up, you can move on to the next one. So once these are removed, you can just snip the ends off, it's not a big deal. We'll be using these wires again. I'll mention these wires again later in the video. Because the plastic is brittle, and these will probably break as you're installing it, we're going to go ahead and we're just going to replace all four of these studs here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to blow out each one and replace them with the Radium ones. That way we got a pretty much four complete, clean, complete new connections. We don't have to worry about any old plastic breaking down because we've now modified it. Now that you've got all the studs off, you can just go ahead and set the level sensor aside. It's going to come off. We'll reinstall that after. Just go ahead and clean up the surface again. This side's not as critical. It's often corroded just like this hat is. Most of the sealing will be done on the back side. We are still going to install a Teflon washer onto the top though. So get it as flat as possible. Okay, so since you're installing this to a metal top hat, you're going to have to run the Teflon washer and the isolation sleeve. The isolation sleeve is going to make sure that there's no shorts in between all of the connections here. Since you're using this, you're going to have to install this into here. Should fit pretty snug. It's almost perfect fit for the S13 hat, just like that. One concern you'll have though is here you can see it does stick past a little bit, so you're gonna have to trim it back pretty much flush, and then you can install your other Teflon washer. Once you have a good idea of where you need to cut it, you can go ahead and you can just place it on a bench and you can just trim it down to length. I recommend using a pretty sharp X-Acto knife so you don't need to struggle. There you go, cut down. Now that you've got it trimmed down, you can see here just a bit of stick out from the surface of the metal. That is okay. Once you put the washer on and you tighten it down, it'll squish a little bit and it'll hold everything secure. You've got all the sleeves on, your Teflon washer's on, you can go ahead and you can tighten down the stud. So now that you've got it installed, you can see our final product. This Teflon washer on the inside is going to do most of the sealing, but the top one will also provide some sealing. That's why I mentioned don't worry about the surface too much on top. So when you're tightening it, make sure the stud is tight. There is no torque spec, but go until you feel like it's tight. If you're unsure, 6 or 7 foot-pounds will probably do it. The crush washers or Teflon washers do squish, so you'll never get 100% metal to metal tightening feel. Just make sure it doesn't turn in the hole. Once you get that one stud installed, you can go ahead and you can repeat the steps for each stud that you decide to install.
Yep.
The nuts are a locking nut, so it will feel a little bit tight as you're tightening it all the way down. So don't be concerned when you only can get the nut on one thread to start. You'll have to tighten it down with a wrench or a set of wrenches or a ratchet. Now that we have all 4 studs installed, you can see using the factory holes just makes it super symmetrical and everything's evenly spaced. And the fact that the holes are the exact right size for these studs makes it really, really easy. Once you've got that installed, you can go ahead and reinstall your level sensor. Make sure the wire routing for your level light is appropriate. That's this thing. You have removed it. If you did all 4 studs, you will have removed this. The fuel level sensor is slotted. One thing most people don't know, if you do remove it and reinstall it, try to line it up with the wear mark that is in there where the screw was. So you can see where the screw was sitting. A little bit of a circle on each side. You can move this left and right to show true empty or true full, whichever way your gas gauge is reading. If you feel like it's a problem, you can always take this out and adjust this. All right, so since we're installing a metal stud into a metal fuel level sender hat, you're going to want to make sure there's no continuity between either stud and each other and either stud and the hat. So we're just going to start by stud to stud. Whoops. So this stud, this stud, this stud, this is what it sounds like when there's a connection. So with this stud, this one, 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 and then we're going to go from stud to hat, stud to hat, stud to hat, stud to hat. No connection. Always make sure the mic is still, or the meter is still working after you do the test, just to verify it wasn't broken during the test. You can also do this with the resistance test. If your meter doesn't make a noise, you can also read. Obviously it doesn't have any continuity there. If it does, it'll give you a reading. Just a crash course on a multimeter. Okay, so you can go ahead, you can snip off these little eyelets here. Throw those in the garbaggio. This is the eyelet that Radium supplies. This is intended for a higher current, larger wire gauge. Okay, for the larger wires, you can use them for the fuel pump wiring. That's what we're going to do. For this application, we're going to be using these ones. These will crimp a little bit better onto this wire. We'll have to fold the wire a couple of times to crimp it, but this will provide a bit of a better stability for this connection. So strip the wire a little bit long. This will allow you to twist. You can see it's a bit long there, and then we're going to double fold. 1, 2. This is a good way to allow you to use a larger gauge crimp with a smaller wire. And you're going to go ahead and crimp it down. These connections here don't require any shrink wrap because we're going to position them more intelligently out of the way, and they won't be contacting each other. All right, so since we're going to be connecting these with a little bit less wire than there was before, we're going to want to space out enough room for the nut to go on, and then we're just going to want to bend these at a 90 degree. And then we can go ahead and install it. So you folded that, you put it at 90, you've installed it to your stud. You can go ahead and put your nut on, tighten her down. You want to hold the crimp in place while you're tightening or it'll turn. Remember I said we're going to place these intelligently so they don't contact the stud next to it. All right, so we're going to be installing a Walbro 450. This pump is pretty much the one we're going to use for this client because he does have plans to make a little bit more power in the future. For right now, the vehicle is a little bit stock, but we are planning for the future, so we have to come back and do this again. Next up, we're going to be using parts from our install kit. The only two pieces we primarily use out of the install kit usually is going to be this sock and this connector. The kit does come with a removable connector that you can use on specific applications. This is just the cheapest kit we have to get the sock and the connector for the pump. Then you have an ethanol safe line in here as well. We won't be using this, it's too short, or too long, sorry, for what we need the length of the hose to be, so we're just going to be using submersible fuel line. And it does come with some worm gear clamps. Don't ever use these. Okay, so what you're going to want to do next is you're going to want to install your sock onto the bottom of your fuel pump. This sock has the lock integrated into it because you can't reach it from the bottom side. Go and give it a good push, and you'll know it's seated when it's just basically touching the bottom of the pump. So the rubber isolator that we're going to be using fits the bottom of the fuel pump with a different kind of sock on it, so we're just going to modify it a little bit to allow it to slip in a little bit further. So once you've got your rubber piece, the OEM one may or may not fit onto the bottom of the fuel pump for you, so you might have to modify it a little bit to get it to fit. Once you've done that, make sure the height is right so these line up nicely. Oftentimes with the 450, it just barely fits. So you're going to want to make sure that fits in there, make sure the fuel pump is installed all the way. And then next up, we're going to be cutting a piece of fuel line for this and mounting the fuel pump to the hanger. This hanger and the factory hanger over there on the floor, the garbage one that we're not going to use, they don't actually have a mount for the fuel pump. It's just held in by pressure against the fuel line and the rubber bushing at the bottom. So we're just going to repeat that on this install. So when the fuel pump fits in the hanger as tight as this one does, when you got the two fuel lines basically lining up, I usually like to try and install the fuel pump line onto this hose first. Install your fuel clamps onto the line, install your rubber onto the bottom of the fuel pump, and then install it to the hanger. Line up your fuel line spouts to each other, and then you can slide down the fuel line. Okay, so once you got the fuel line on the shaft and you have the fuel pump installed, you might have to apply a little bit of lube to the tip of the fuel pump in order to get the fuel line to slide on. And then we're just going to pry it down. Once you have your fuel line installed, you can go ahead and install your clamps. Okay, now that you've got your fuel pump installed, we can go ahead and move on to the wiring. One thing to note, again, I did mention this briefly, the submersible fuel line. Make sure you always use submersible fuel line. Gasoline can be run on the inside of most fuel injection line, but as soon as it's submersed on the outside, it could swell up and cause a restriction in the line, giving you all sorts of problems. This one's really short, so it wouldn't swell up and cause any issues. But if you did have a longer application where it could, you could face some problems. All right, so next up, we're going to do the wiring for the fuel pump. Our install kit comes with this connector here. You can just go ahead and plug it in. It is a tight fit, it is watertight. So it does take a bit of effort to plug in. There we go. All right, so once you have the connector plugged in, I usually try to take up the extra slack in the wire by running this down here somewhere and then zip tying it to the side. Once you have that zip tied, you can go ahead and install your connectors on the end of here, and then we'll bolt into the studs. So you're just going to want to crimp, just like we did in the previous connections. These wires don't need to be folded, they're correct size for this crimp gauge. I am using my own eyelets again. These ones are a little bit too big for this size of wire. These ones will be used on the outside when we use a larger gauge of wire. For the power wire, you're going to want to just install a little bit of heat sleeve. Crimp it down. And then once you have that installed, 90 degree the connector, and you can install it to the power stud. This last wire here, you're just going to install to the last power stud and install your nut. So once you have all those installed, you're going to want to mark the top for which one's power, which one's ground, or take a photo and remember the orientation. One thing I'm going to have to do on this hat that's a little bit different from others, this ground strap did break. This is pretty much a case ground for the fuel level sensor. Because the fuel level sensor is getting its ground source through the casing, I'm going to have to run a new ground from inside the case to this new ground stud that we have here for the fuel pump, and then we should be okay.